logistics and freight and everything that goes with that. Of course, it's all about getting the goods into your customers' hands in good order and then getting paid. If you haven't got the goods in the hands of your customer, clearly your customer is not going to pay you, and therefore that all-important sale has not actually occurred. So today's session, we're going to look at export logistics and the logistics process. We're going to touch on transport documentation, the transportation process. We're going to look at Incoterms, and finally, we're going to look at risk. Now, bear in mind, as is always the case in these webinars, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box and feel free to type them as you think of them. If it's appropriate, I'll take the question at the time that I notice it. If not, we'll wait until the end. But please don't wait until the end to type the question, because you may have forgotten that you in fact wanted to ask it. I also just want to point out that today's session is a basic freight and logistics type session. We're going to touch on some important concepts, but the real freight and logistics stream is still to come, with the first in those more advanced sessions starting this coming Friday. There will be 4 webinars in the freight stream, and then, well, it would have been 8 face-to-face workshops, but of course, in Victoria, we currently are facing some COVID restrictions. So we've made the decision that at least 4 of the 8 face-to-face sessions will also now be presented in webinar form. So 12 webinars and possibly another 4 workshops, but we'll keep you posted on the format of those as the current situation in Melbourne and surrounding areas unfolds. So let's start with export logistics and the logistics process. So of course, export logistics represents the entire supply chain, end to end, and that includes streamlining of order handling on your side, transportation obviously, but also inventory management and handling, storage, packaging, clearing of goods, both for export and on the other side of the equation for import, and everything that occurs before that shipment actually enters the overseas port and makes it into the hands of your customer. Efficient export logistics management can and will, particularly in the current environment, give you a competitive advantage, because you'll handle your orders better. You'll also reduce your product cycles. And of course, if you don't get this component of your export process right, you can incur increased costs, and there will be poor service, which will be passed on to your customer. Your customer will not be happy, you will lose revenue, and chances are you will also lose market share. So it really doesn't matter how well you do what you do internally if you cannot then get those goods that you have produced into the hands of your customers. Logistics is where it all hinges. And at the moment, when we're all living in a COVID world, and in some cases we thought it was a post-COVID world, but the reality is COVID and the incumbent restrictions have changed the face of logistics and freight for the foreseeable future. It has also added an enormous burden of cost over and above the usual costs for freight and logistics, because it's that much more complicated and that much more difficult to get space to get goods onto either a ship or indeed into the belly of an aeroplane. And again, as I mentioned at the start of today's session, we'll be delving a lot deeper into some of those issues in the freight and logistics stream, which is coming up. So the logistics process, of course, once the product has been cleared for dispatch from your end, the logistics process formally starts. So you've produced it, you've packed it, and now it's got to the point where you are starting to think of getting it into the hands of your customer. The first thing, of course, is to select the mode of shipping. Is it going by sea or is it going by air? And there are certain products that, of course, you are not allowed to ship by sea. You have to ship them by air because it's actually a lot quicker and less dangerous. There are certain products that it's not viable to ship by air because they're too heavy, they take up too much space, it would cost too much. You're going to ship them by sea. If something is really time sensitive, air freight, of course, is the way to go because it takes a lot longer to get through sea freight. So these are all things that you have to bring into the equation and all the factors that have to weigh into whether you are selecting sea or air. If we were in a country that had land borders with another country, so if we were in Europe, for example, there would be other modes of transport that we would consider for that cross-border process. We might consider rail. Of course, that's not an option if we are shipping from Australia to another country. We could also be considering inland waterways if we were in that situation where we had borders, land borders with another country. Customs clearance needs to be arranged, and that means it needs to be arranged on both sides. So, both from Australia, there are certain export procedures that have to be followed, and particularly in some areas where some goods need specific permission to be exported from Australia. And then, of course, on the other side, in order to enter a country, there are various customs procedures that have to be gone through and documentation that follows the customs process. The shipping method needs to be finalized. So, for example, if you are shipping by sea or ocean freight, you have to choose between services like consolidation, less than a container load, so LCL, or full container load, FCL, project cargo, etc. Um, if you don't have a full cargo load, then the options are a lot more varied for you because then you can choose to take part of a container with somebody else, or you can choose to have an even smaller component and you have a consolidator who puts all your goods in with other goods of a similar nature that can be shipped together. And this is quite common in the food and beverage sector, where if you are a producer of a food item, but you don't ship huge amounts of that food item, but you do ship sufficient to be on a container as opposed to being in an air cargo container, you might be consolidated with other products of your nature that will also be food related. It's usually in terms of ocean shipping, but it can work for air loads as well. And then final delivery is arranged at the port of destination. Now, final delivery from the port where the goods arrive in the country could be on a truck, it could be on a train, it could be on some sort of inland waterway system, etc. So that all happens on the other side of the equation, but all of those decisions are made at the start of the logistics process. Now, goods to be shipped must be packed in an export-ready manner. Of course, that means that you have to take into account how you've packed the goods. Goods that you pack to ship door to door in Australia will almost certainly need different packing materials to get them offshore. They need to be packed a lot more sturdily because they're going to be thrown around a lot. They need to be packed in such a way that if something goes on top of them, they're not going to be crushed, etc. And you have to give instructions that if you do ship something which is relatively fragile, it does not go into the bottom of a container. So just some logical things that need to apply, but things that we sometimes take as common sense and for granted still need to be specified. And of course, there's all the necessary marking and labeling, not just of the goods themselves, which would have gone into the packages. And those are all things that you would have figured out ahead of time, what you need to have on the label of your product when it arrives in the country to which you're exporting it. But we're talking also of the labeling of any cases, packaging, cartons, etc. So all the stuff that goes on the outside of your products. If you have more than one package in the lot, you have to have a packing list. So exactly what is in this particular load. The goods are then cleared from the exporter's premises, and that is if there are any excise formalities and they've already been completed. Product collected from your facility and transported to the port, and then the product is dispatched from the port. And when we're talking about port, we're not just talking about seaport, of course, we're also talking about airport. When we talk about air transport, we actually still use the marine terminology that relates to ships. So a lot of the same principles apply. Now, if you use the services of an efficient freight forwarder, of course, this process can be made a lot less complicated because your freight forwarder will take responsibility for the process. However, and this is something which I do need to stress, your freight forwarder is a service provider. If there is an issue with the shipment, so for example, something has been incorrectly added to a bill of lading, etc., your freight forwarder ultimately is not the one responsible. Ultimately, you are. So even if you use the services of a freight forwarder, you still need to understand this process and you still need to be involved in it. You cannot simply wash your hands of this now and say that it's not your problem anymore, because it does actually remain your responsibility and your obligation. So bear that in mind. Now, of course, anybody who's ever sent anything overseas, even if it's a small parcel that you might have sent to a friend in another country, there is export documentation involved. The larger the shipment, the more complicated the shipment, the more documentation is involved. So if you are sending something B2C, business to consumer, and it's just a small parcel, chances are you don't have to jump through all of these documentation hoops, particularly if that parcel weighs under 2 kilograms. Then there's a simple form that's completed, but there is still a form. So that's important to note. Some of the transport documentation that you will encounter if you are sending larger shipments. Oh, sorry, I just went to the next slide. Some of the things that you will encounter if you are sending those larger shipments, you can see in front of you there. And they include the commercial invoice, which has to be included, the dock or the port receipt, the bill of lading, a certificate of origin if you want to claim origin under a free trade agreement. And in some cases, even if you're not claiming origin under a free trade agreement, you still need a certificate of origin to prove that goods originate in a particular country. And in this case, of course, that is Australia. You need a warehouse receipt, an inspection certificate, an export license if you are exporting goods that are controlled. So certain agricultural goods need export licenses. You can't just willy-nilly send them out of Australia. If you are in the defense sector, you definitely need export licenses for anything that you export. And in some cases, there are other things like chemicals, etc., that need specific export licenses. Packing lists. So what exactly is in this shipment? And I've spoken to people in the past that have had problems where, for example, they are shipping a specific kind of good. Let's say, for example, it's wine, and the packing list includes every bottle of wine and all the specifications around that. But they've decided in that particular shipment to also include some free gifts for their customers. And those free gifts could be t-shirts, for example. The t-shirts are not packed separately. They put in the cartons with the wine because it's a logical, sensible thing to do, and they sent off. The only problem is the packing list didn't contain the t-shirts as well because they had no commercial value. However, your packing list does not depend on the commercial value of the shipment. It is all about the items in that package. So if you're including something other than the actual goods, you still have to list that stuff. Now, in the case of those t-shirts, that particular shipment went to the United States. Those t-shirts were cotton and they were made in China. And that produced a massive knock-on effect when those goods arrived in the United States because cotton from China was not allowed. So the entire shipment was stopped at the port and was not allowed into the United States. So you do have to be very careful when it comes to your documentation. It needs to be accurate. It might seem cumbersome. It might be silly that you include all the information on it, but you do need to. You really don't have a choice in that. Any health certificates, so if it's something that needs to have passed quarantine inspection in Australia and proven that it has passed quarantine inspection before it enters another country, you're going to have to include those certificates, etc. Your insurance certificate, you have to have marine insurance, so you have to include the fact that that is there. And if there are any consular documents, now these are very specific ones, which for most shipments are not needed. There are others. The list is almost it doesn't end pretty much. It just depends on what your good is, where it's going to, because different requirements from the importing country will also affect the type of documentations that you need. But bear in mind, there are a lot of them. You need to find out what they are for your particular good and your particular market, and you have to include all of them when you need them. So if we look at the transportation in process, we have to look at who's involved, because there are many, many different links in this chain, and every single person and organization along the way plays a role. Of course, it all starts with you, the seller. And then on the other side of the equation sits the buyer. But in between, you have the banks that sit on either side of the transaction. And we're not even going to touch on letters of credit and things of that nature in today's session, because that really isn't part of what we're talking about, but you do need to take that into account. So depending on how you're going to get paid for this, if there is a letter of credit involved, there are several steps in that process as well, and even more documentation. But you have the banks. Somewhere a bank is releasing funds from the buyer to the seller, and that has a number of different steps in the process. The insurance company, of course, that is insuring the goods that are being sent. The export freight forwarder. So the freight forwarder has a whole role to play here that is a very important one. The customs agent. Now, in some cases, the customs agent and the freight forwarder is the same organization. Some freight forwarders handle all of the logistical process, including customs. In other cases, you might have a freight forwarder to do the logistical side of it, and you have a customs agent that deals with everything related to customs, and that is all the paperwork, all the duties, etc. Of course, there is the Department of Customs, whatever they might be called in a specific country, on both ends of the equation too. Customs here is going to inspect goods. Customs here is going to make sure that all the paperwork is in order, that you are in fact shipping what you say you are in the documentation, etc. And similarly, on the other end, when the goods arrive, the customs authorities there are going to inspect the goods to see if they align with the paperwork, if they have the right HS codes attached to them, for example, and that everything matches up. The port authorities on both sides. So in the case of Melbourne, you're going to be shipping through the port of Melbourne, and they have a very real role to play. Similarly, the port, if you're sending to Shanghai, for example, the port of Shanghai has a very important role to play on the other side of the equation. The transport providers, so the people who physically transport the goods, the shipping companies, which are different from the transport providers. So those are all people and organizations in this chain, and all of these links in the chain require certain procedures and documentation for them to move on to the next phase of the process. So the process there in picture form, which sometimes makes these things a little bit clearer, it starts with the inspection and quality check of the goods. So that sits with you, the seller. It goes through to packaging, labeling, and marking of the goods, getting the delivery order, stuffing and sealing the containers, and of course, marking them appropriately, arranging intermodal transfer of goods to the point of loading, goods arrive at the port. So the transport to the point of loading is where it goes. So intermodal transfer, it goes from your factory floor onto a truck. That truck goes to the container port, and then it gets to the port. It arrives at the port, it's cleared by customs, all the documentation is checked against the physical goods to make sure that the things match. Any port dues are paid, handover of any documents to the shipping line, you get the bill of lading, you send the original bill of lading to the buyer, the goods depart from the port of origin, and somewhere along the line, hopefully, money makes its way into your bank account. So let's take a closer look at that process. So once the goods are manufactured and the pre-shipment inspection, quality checks, etc., are done, the exporter and the customs house agent packages, labels, marks the goods to adhere to the standard shipping practices. The exporter or the freight forwarder gets the delivery order that needs to be collected, makes the arrangement for pickup, stuffing, etc. They then arrange for the intermodal transport and they carry the goods from your factory floor. Once the goods arrive at the port, the exporter or the agent arranges for customs clearance, documentation, physical variation, and pays any port dues. The documents and mates receipts are handed to the shipping line, which then provides a bill of lading to the exporter, and the exporter has to send the original bill of lading and any other documents to the buyer or their consignee or agent. And then the goods are loaded onto the carrier and they depart from the port of origin. It's a complicated process. There are lots of steps involved, and it is important that as an exporter, you do everything possible to optimize and streamline the process. So, very important is good planning. If anything should have hit you like a ton of bricks already today, it's that this stuff is complicated and it needs to be mapped out and planned properly. Because if you don't and you miss a step in the process, your goods simply aren't going to clear customs either in Australia or on the other end. Your customer's not going to get what they've paid for and they're not going to be happy. There are many people involved in this process, and many of those people will be within your own organization. So it is very important that you understand how to manage the people in this chain. And it's not just the people in your warehouse who are involved in this process, it's everybody in your organization that is involved in export, from the sales staff to the marketing team, through to the warehousing and the logistics and the shipping people, the supply chain experts. They all need to understand where they fit into this equation because they all have a part to play. Good warehousing practices, of course, go without saying. If you can't find it on a shelf, you can't ship it. If it has been mislabeled, it's going to create problems with the documentation at the other end, etc. So you need to have a proper warehousing setup. Even if your operation is small and you might be shipping from home, you still need to store your goods in such a way that they are accessible, that they are easy to find, they are easy to pick, and they are easy to pack. Of course, the bigger your operation gets, the more important this gets. The choice that you make in terms of how you are going to transport the goods is vitally important. Whether it goes by sea or by air is going to have very important effects in terms of the state that the goods arrive in, the bottom line for you in terms of the cost, etc. So you need to understand that, and you need to understand why you've chosen the mode of transport. And very importantly, if you are able to automate any part of this process, you should do so. And that doesn't mean you need machines to pick and pack. Robot automation, great stuff. But we're not talking necessarily about that. We're talking about automating your processes. So if you can avoid manual handling at any time in this process, you will cut down on errors and you will certainly save a lot of time and a lot of money at the end of the day. So do think about the possibility of automation. Now, before we move away from transport and logistics and the export process, we do have to pause on Incoterms. Some of you will hopefully be familiar with Incoterms. If you are an experienced exporter, even if you haven't exported huge amounts, but if you have exported goods, you almost certainly are aware of Incoterms. If you haven't, if you've only just started exporting, or you're thinking of exporting, or indeed you've been exporting via e-commerce and you've just done it B2C, then you might not be familiar with Incoterms. Now, Incoterms are the international standard trade definitions that are used to define the responsibilities of sellers and buyers for the transport and the delivery of goods. So the word literally is a shortened form of international commercial terms. They're fundamentally important because they generally are incorporated into sales contracts worldwide, and they are understood to mean the same thing worldwide. So the Incoterms rules describe the tasks, the costs, and the risks involved in the delivery of goods from sellers to buyers. So they explain how the goods move from the hands of the seller to the hands of the buyer, and who is responsible for every part of the process along the way. Now, very important to note that Incoterms are rules, they're not the law. So they're not contained in statute, but they are rules that are understood everywhere in the world to mean the same thing. Now, Incoterms are fundamental to your sales negotiation process because you need to confirm with your buyer who's paying for carriage, the transport of the goods, who will arrange for the carriage, who will bear the risk of loss or damage to the goods, and finally, who will take responsibility for customs clearance and costs. And all of those things are encapsulated in the Incoterms. So when you are negotiating your sales contract with your client, you are going to determine who takes the risk and the responsibility along the way and carries the cost. And that is ultimately going to affect the price. So if you, as the seller, take all the risk, your price can be a lot higher because you've got all of these additional responsibilities and, of course, all the additional costs. If, however, you transfer all of that to the buyer and they are quite happy to take it on, you're probably going to have to reduce your cost because they are going to have to carry all the costs involved and all the risks accrue to them too. So when you're using Incoterms, and we're going to look at a moment in what they actually are, but when you use them, you have to choose the most appropriate one, and that is based on the goods. It's also based on that relationship and the negotiation. You need to incorporate the Incoterms rules explicitly into your sales contract. Now, at the moment, we're still using Incoterms 2010, even though Incoterms 2020 are already in existence, but you can still use 2010. And Incoterms are revised every 10 years or so. And there's a fair process that goes into it, even if there's not always a lot of change. So you need to specify your place or your port as accurately as possible when you do this. For example, FCA 10 Collins Street, Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, specifically related to Incoterms 2010, or FCA Qantas Cargo Terminal, Melbourne Tullamarine International Airport, Incoterms 2010. You recognize the valid 11 Incoterms, and there are 11 of them, and refer to them by their 3 uppercase letter abbreviations. And you need to distinguish between those Incoterms that should be used exclusively for traditional maritime transport and those that are appropriate for all modes of transport. So Incoterms go back to a time when pretty much all goods were sent by sea. And over time, of course, the modes of transport have changed, so the Incoterms have changed to keep pace. So what are the Incoterms? Here they are. You see them in front of you here. The rules for any mode or modes of transport, so whether it goes by sea, air, rail, inland waterway, etc. You have X-Works, EXW, FCA, free carrier, CPT, carriage paid to, and a place is specified, CIP, carriage and insurance paid, and again to a specific place, DPU, delivered at place unloaded, which replaces Incoterms 2010, which was DAT, which was delivered at terminal, DIP, delivered at place, DDP, delivered duty paid. And then the rules that apply only to sea and inland waterway transport for obvious reasons. FAS, free alongside ship. And here the term actually refers to a vessel on water. It's an actual ship, not an airship. FOB, free on board, CFR, cost and freight, and CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. Now, you need to familiarize yourself with the Incoterms, exactly what they mean, and the responses and the obligations between the seller and the buyer, and when that obligation and when that responsibility shifts from one to the other, because it's very important that you choose the right one. Very often you will hear people refer to, oh, we priced at FOB, because that becomes almost the commonplace term, but it's not always correct. So you need to understand the implications of using a term when you use it. Now, to get your copy of the latest Incoterms, you need to buy it from the International Chamber of Commerce, and you see the address in front of you there on the screen. That address will take you to the site where you can actually buy the Incoterms 2020, and it will also give you a sense of exactly what they're all about. So there's a quick reference guide that you see there, which has been provided by Incodocs. And you can see quite clearly, if you look at the blue and the gray, where the responsibility shifts from the buyer to the seller and the seller to the buyer. So that's just something to bear in mind as well. And you can generally find these online and you can download them. So we've talked quite exhaustively about logistics and the export process involving logistics, and some of the stuff can be relatively complicated. But it's also important that when we're thinking about getting goods into the hands of our customers, we also think about risk. So we're going to touch now in the remainder of today's session on some factors that you need to take into account when it comes to risk. So export risk is the difference between success and failure when doing business overseas. I mean, that's the bottom line. And the key to being successful is being prepared. Now, whenever you enter a new market, you're going into a new country, you're going into a new type of product, etc., there's always risk. But if you identify those risks ahead of time and you put mitigating measures in place, you will minimize the impact on your business and you will increase the chances of success in your chosen market. So export risk varies dramatically depending on where it is you're selling into. But there are 4 risks that are common to all Australian business, and particularly small businesses that very often are subject to more vagaries than big business because they have less of a buffer to contain some of the damage that might occur. Small businesses, but all businesses, really need to consider risk in 4 main areas. The first one is political risk. So an uncertain political environment, of course, will hamper export operations. And it happens in several ways. So if there's a trade embargo, well, you won't be able to send goods to that country. If they're already on the water, they won't be allowed in. Civil war, political violence could affect how safe it is for your staff to operate or your customers to operate, in fact, any of the partners that you have in that market. And if by some chance that happens in Australia, of course, that also affects the sort of issues that might be faced. So political risk here, for example, would also encompass things like strike action that could affect the port here, and goods simply can't get out. Political instability could result in defaults on payments, so your customers simply might not be allowed to or able to pay you. There could be confiscation of property and assets. So you might have shipped the goods are confiscated on the other ends, and you've lost them and you're not going to get paid. And of course, blockages in the transfer of earnings. So you might have operated in a particular market and you've always been able to get your funds out of that market. Something changes politically and now you cannot expatriate the funds. And that, of course, is an enormous problem and has huge effects for your cash flow and for your future business. Then there are legal risks. Now, legal requirements and processes, of course, are very different from market to market. So you need to understand what all of those are in the markets that you're going into. But there are things like local contract law, which could be very different from the local contract law in Australia. And you could have put in place a sales contract, which is in fact deemed invalid in the country into which you are selling because you have used terminology that is not accepted there. Patent registration and IP requirements, and we have talked about these before, but this is something that you have to bear in mind, because if you lose your IP in a particular market, you also lose your future market there. Product liability laws. So the laws that we have in Australia that protect consumers could be considerably different from the laws and the requirements in other countries, and you might find yourself liable in ways that you had not anticipated and facing damages that you could not have anticipated. Dispute resolution processes are different. Operational health and safety rules are very different in other countries. So again, you need to take all of that stuff into account. And then, of course, there are operating risks. So the operating environment in every market is different, and many of those operating environments could be totally different from the way in which we do things in Australia. And that means we need to take into account things like industrial relations policies and practices, permitting rules and import requirements, etc. So what is it that is required in the importing country, and what do you have to do to comply? And if something goes wrong, what do you have in place to mitigate the risk? And then the final risk that we're going to touch on today is currency risk. Now, we talked at fair length at the previous webinar about foreign exchange, but it is important to note that if there are movements in exchange rates that you didn't take into account, there could be a loss of earnings, or your profit could be lower than you had anticipated. Now, you can protect yourself by quoting only in Australian dollars, or you can take out a foreign exchange facility that will allow you to lock in exchange rates and, of course, hedge your currency exposure. And we talked about some of the other tools and mechanisms that you could possibly employ to mitigate some of your foreign exchange exposure and the incumbent risk. Now, of course, there are other risks. Basic things like losing the goods at sea, that happens. Containers fall overboard all the time. Things get lost on airport tarmacs, for example. Things get stolen on either side of the equation. Less likely in Australia, but it's quite common in some other ports. If you are shipping to a country like South Africa, for example, chances are at some point something is going to disappear before the shipment makes it into the hands of your buyer. So you need to take into account all the risks. You cannot ignore them, and you need to have mitigating factors in place. And that includes insurance. It includes marine insurance. It includes trade credit insurance if you're not sure you're going to get paid. And every other link in the risk chain needs to have an action that balances the potential risk. For you as an exporter, particularly if you are relatively inexperienced, you need to understand all the risks. You need to map them out for yourself. And it's better to err on the side of caution than to not know something or to ignore something. And then you need to have a plan of how you're going to deal with everything that could go wrong should it go wrong. That way, it may never go wrong and you'll be fine, but if it does, you won't be caught short. And that brings us to the end of today's session. You are more than welcome still to pose any questions in the chat box if you've had them. I know we've covered a lot of ground, and for some of you, we might have covered some unfamiliar territory when it comes to those export procedures and documentations, and also indeed Incoterms. I've also used the term HS code, which might have been unfamiliar to some of you. An HS code is part of the harmonized system. And again, it's a digit in this case, it's numbers that denote a product. So rather than us writing out on our export documentation huge amounts of text, We can use an HS code, and that HS code will tell us what the good is, what it's made from, etc. And an HS code generally at its shortest form is 2 numbers, and there are 97 categories, main categories of HS code, so it can go up to 97. But then there are other numbers that are added as we get more specific about what those particular goods are. And generally we use a 6-digit HS code, but we can go to HS codes that can run into 8, 12, and in certain countries even more. So just familiarize yourself with the HS code system as well.